The British public have always recognised the bravery and dedication of our outstanding armed forces personnel who serve around the world to keep our nation safe. The UK made a commitment to the Afghans who worked for and with our armed forces during combat operations in Afghanistan.
Why was there a boy on that PB? What did that commander say to you?
There's a legal concept in the United Kingdom that we don't have in Canada, and I don't think they have it in the United States either. It's called super-injunction. Now, you know what the word injunction means. It's typically an order, usually a court order. An injunction, we have them all the time in Canada to compel people to do things. And one of the kinds of injunctions we have is a court-ordered publication ban. In courts, it's usually if there's a minor involved, if a youth is charged with a crime, most of the time his identity will be kept secret. If a youth is a victim of a crime, especially a sex crime, their identity will be kept secret. Another example is a jury trial. Before the jury is selected and sequestered, there's a publication ban on any salacious allegations the police or the prosecutors might make, so the jury pool does not get tainted with some false allegation. But what these all have in common is you know they exist. You know there's a publication ban, and you know the rough reasons why. It's a child. It's an accused criminal. In some cases, the publication ban will later be lifted. That's sort of normal where we come from, but in the UK, they have something called a super-injunction. It's an injunction, a publication ban that has an extra layer on top. You're not even allowed to talk about the publication ban. It's like a ban on talking about a ban on talking. And the idea is to swallow up any words that might come from a thing that's going on. It's pretty incredible. It's the most powerful injunction I've ever heard of. It feels something that could only be applied in a sort of police state. I don't even know if a super injunction would be lawful in the United States with their First Amendment, and I don't think it's ever been tried in Canada. But there has been a super injunction in the UK that was only lifted about a day and a half ago, and only now are we learning about the most astonishing thing. First of all, this super injunction was actually requested by the government. And by the way, super injunctions, they're against the whole world. I think the phrase in Latin is ad mundum. The entire world is ordered by a court in the UK to stay silent about something. Obviously, if the fact had leaked out in the United States, someone enterprising could have published it there and taunted the British courts. But this was such an unusual case. It was requested by the British government. It was granted by the British courts. It kept the facts secret even from members of Parliament and members of the House of Lords. That's their version of the Senate over there. So cabinet ministers knew about it. The Prime Minister knew about it, but not even MPs. And I remind you that this super injunction about 2 years ago, it kept the secrets during the last UK elections, which were actually on July 4th of last year, just over a year ago. So this super injunction was brought in by the Conservative government, run by Rishi Sunak at the time, one of the worst prime ministers in British history. But the Labour Party won the election on July 4th, and they kept this super injunction in place. I say again, it was the government that requested it. And the new Labour Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who's a lawyer himself, both of the parties, Labour and Conservative, both of the leaders, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, are for open borders, mass immigration. And both of them supported a super injunction about the most insane story you're ever going to hear. It's crazy, it's kooky, it's absurd, it's laughable, and it is the state of affairs over there. Here is their current defense minister trying to explain.
The British public have always recognised the bravery and dedication of our outstanding armed forces personnel who serve around the world to keep our nation safe. The UK made a commitment to the Afghans who worked for and with our armed forces during combat operations in Afghanistan. It was a commitment that we would repay the moral obligation we owed to those who fought alongside us, resettling them in the UK through the Afghan Relocations and Assistance Policy Resettlement Scheme, or ARAP for short. The Defence Secretary has now announced that in February 2022, under the previous government, a defence official mistakenly emailed a dataset containing personal information of thousands of Afghan citizens who had applied to the ARAP scheme. This serious and shocking data breach, discovered 18 months later, was a clear violation of data protection protocols. The previous government responded by requesting an injunction to prevent public disclosure of the breach and setting up a secret Afghan response route to resettle Afghans at the highest risk of Taliban reprisals due to the breach. We are now announcing that we are closing the route and supporting the injunction being lifted, putting this into the public domain for proper scrutiny for the very first time. Although the details of the route were not public, everyone who came to the UK under this route has already been counted and published as part of the existing immigration figures. To date, under this route, around 4,500 people have been resettled or are in transit to the UK, a small proportion of total Afghan arrivals. When we came into office, we began a detailed assessment of the situation, which led to an independent review led by a former Deputy Chief of Defence Intelligence. You're finding out now because the independent review commissioned by our government concluded that the threat has come down, and after carefully considering risk, transparency, and cost to the taxpayer, we have decided to close the scheme and bring it into public knowledge. We have now notified affected individuals, launched a dedicated website to support and provide guidance to those affected, and reaffirmed our commitment to processing any applications that are outstanding within Afghan resettlement schemes. You may rightly be concerned, as I was, by this information, but our action shows this government will take the decisions necessary to ensure transparency and accountability while maintaining our commitment to those who served alongside our armed forces over many years.
He started off by saying that there was a moral obligation to bring all the Afghans to the UK. Where did that obligation come from? Is there a moral obligation to bring home the whole idea of going to war in Afghanistan, if I recall George W. Bush correctly, was to fight the bad guys over there so as not to have them over here. And there is no vetting of these Afghans. And in fact, certain who are flagged as having security risks are allowed in anyways. He says that 4,500 came through this scheme, but other reports put it up to 24,000. And in fact, they're allowed to bring their families with them, which means there'll be well over 100,000 Afghans brought into the United Kingdom. And they have some sort of moral claim. Here's a news story that one man brought 14 dependents with him. Just incredible. There is no security screening, and even those with red flags, as I say, are accepted. They are allowed to choose whether or not they want to work. If they want to, great, not sure what their skill set is. And if they don't want to, that's fine too. The British will house them and give them welfare for the rest of their lives, and I guess their children's lives and their grandchildren's lives. They're allowed to bring in their family. And veterans report that they are getting preferential housing. These thousands of Afghans that were brought in unmarked planes secretly under this super-injunction, many of them were housed at housing on military bases, as in the housing that was supposed to go to military families. Veterans say they were kicked out, and these Afghans were allowed in. They're quickly learning the British way, or they're quickly being weaponized by British lawyers. Not sure which is which. I see that 650 of these Afghans have now decided to sue the British government for a data link. So these are people from a medieval level economy, the average GDP per capita in Afghanistan is $450 a year. They live on less than $1.50 a day. You better believe they're going to be millionaires when they're done suing the government for this data leak. Were there really tens of thousands of Afghan translators? That sounds a bit high. Soldiers are saying there were tops 1,000. And even if you take the government's numbers, which I don't, that 4,500 have since come over, it's clearly a political decision to use this as an excuse to bring them in. Seriously, there are data leaks all the time. Since when is this kind of a policy decision kept a secret during an election, no less? Total complicity of what I call the Uniparty. In Canada, I think we've broken away from the Uniparty. The Conservative Party has a different point of view. But in the UK Labour and the UK Conservatives on this issue of immigration are in lockstep with each other. And what of the media itself? Most media did not know about this, but there were several reporters who were in the thick of the story. They were called into government offices and handed the super-injunction, as were their companies. Now, some of them did lawyer up and try and argue for the super-injunction to be lifted. You have to give them credit for that. But they failed, as you heard, and for 2 years this was a secret. There were reporters who knew about it and decided to abide the law, the greatest secret in recent UK history. I suppose there were greater secrets during various wars, but this was a peacetime decision to cover up a political failure, not a national security story. Their lawyers tried to get the super-injunction lifted, but none of the journalists involved thought this story was important enough to break it against the injunction. Now, that would be contempt of court. It would be against the law to publish this story in the face of this ruling. But none of them thought it was of a great enough public interest that they would suffer those consequences. And none of them thought that perhaps they would inform someone in the United States on the lowdown and have them publish it. Because I think actually in the United Kingdom, the regime in the media, I think they get called the regime media fairly, they agree with the open borders government. You sort of had a teamwork effort here. You had the Labour Party and the Conservative Party both demanding from the court party that the media party, and I use party for each of them because they're all the same point of view, they're all on the same team, and they all agreed with each other, and there wasn't a single dissident willing to risk it. Let me quote to you from someone who I enjoy reading what he has to say. It's Dominic Cummings, a former senior advisor to Boris Johnson, who's, I guess you could call him sort of like the Steve Bannon of the UK. Let me just read his tweet, which is spot on. Some of the names may not ring a bell, but it's not even that important. Next move on Wallace's Afghan debacle, lawyers swarming to bring compensation cases for the Afghans. They've been traumatized. Mental health, I showed you that's already happening. So as well as moving soldiers' families out of their homes for the Afghans, as well as bringing the dude who blackmailed the Ministry of Defense because obviously he was at risk in Afghanistan, they actually did that, the guy who said, I caught you, and bringing his family because the European Convention on Human Rights gives a right to family life. And bringing all the rest of the families also because the Convention on Human Rights costing billions. The next move will be to bring billions to compensate them for bringing them here. Then there'll be the billions in benefits. Then there'll be all the money spent dealing with their inevitable crimes. And remember, our courts have decreed and our MPs have accepted that the worse their crimes abroad, the more they are protected by the European Convention on Human Rights, because the more at risk they are if deported from reprisals in countries outside the ECHR. And remember, the courts have decreed that no crime, however horrific, is more important than giving them their rights to family life, even when these rights apply to stepchildren they have raped. The system is working bang on as intended and will continue until regime change. I know that sounds crazy, but that's already happening. Suing because of the data leak. Okay, so you brought them to the UK. Well, suing because you forced us to come to the UK. And then we don't want a job. And they are not going to be asked to have a job because they were relocated. It is the worst. And to call this a state secret shows that you can't trust freedom of speech anymore. They're all in on it. Just incredible. In case you missed it, the blackmailer himself was allowed in. It's just, this is the most astonishing thing I've seen. And it reminds me of my friend Tommy Robinson, who served 7 months in prison because he published a video that he believed was in the public interest that a court told him was not. I'm talking about his own documentary on censorship. Tommy made the decision that the world had to see that, and over 160 million people saw it on Twitter before he took it down. He paid a big price for that, and he told me he didn't regret it. Not so for the regime journalists. They were only too happy to keep this whole disgraceful mess a secret. By the way, in the UK, they often measure crimes based on nationality. Something I think we should do here in Canada too. And in every study, Afghans are the rapiest. They rape at a far higher rate than any other nationality because rape is tolerated in Afghanistan. It is culturally accepted. And this was something that astonished British, American, and Canadian forces who served in Afghanistan. They would come across these young boys. There's a phrase, Bacha Bazi. They were dancing boys. They were sexual slaves for the Afghan allies of the West. And the nightly screaming of the boys gave many soldiers PTSD. If you don't believe me, take a look at this. I've heard this story 100 times. This is just one of 1,000 instances of Western allied soldiers, in this case Brits, saying to their Afghan allies, "Why are you raping the children?" Watch this all the way through. He actually explains his rationale at the end.
Before that briefing had happened, Major Stuber knew that 3 young boys had been shot dead on police patrol bases. All 3 of them were Chai boys. So young boys who'd been abducted by the police commanders and were used as servants. They served tea, but also sex slaves. They're raped by the police commanders. And you see them on every base. You see several boys, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not, but 13, 14 years old. It's very common practice there. 3 of them had been shot dead by the police, 1 possibly by another Chai boy, nobody's quite sure. And he's just found out that a 4th boy has been shot at point blank range in the leg for trying to escape. And you know, I was there, so he let me follow him to meet the acting police chief and confront him about this.
Yesterday, we had unfortunate news come in. A young boy, about 13, maybe 14 years of age, was shot. Now, there's a couple of things on there that you and I have talked about. We've had all the PB commanders in this very room about having young boys and civilians on PBs.
I have mentioned it more than 20 times.
I know.
Why
was there a boy on that PB? What did that commander say to you?
Absolutely disgusting. Put aside the £7 billion that have already been spent on this scheme. Put aside the smashing of democracy to get this done in secret. Put aside the fact that the courts were in cahoots with both parties and that the media, well, they protested, I'll give them that, but no one was brave enough to break the ban. Put aside all that. They are bringing in thousands of men who you know are liars. There weren't 24,000 translators for the Brits. And who, as a nation, rape. Do you think that's suddenly going to end because they're on an 8-hour flight to London? Go to rebelnewsplus.com. Members get instant access to all of our shows, invitations to exclusive events, and access to our premium content like live event footage and documentaries you won't see anywhere else. Only Rebel News Plus members can join the conversation by participating in the comments section of our new website. That way you can have your say too. More than anything though, you'll be able to take pride in supporting real, honest journalism, and you'll help our talented team continue to do the work to push back on the establishment. We really can use your help. We need it, in fact. So thank you. and enjoy Rebel News Plus.